Good morning, everyone. Good Monday morning, everyone. I'm Jason Gourmet with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Delighted to welcome you to a conversation of one of what I think is the most important elements of competently governing a divided country. We are here to talk about direct congressional spending. As we get towards the end of the year, get a little reflective. And when I think about all the efforts that BPC's democracy team has worked on to try to strengthen the effectiveness of governing, I think there's kind of two things that really stand out. The first is our efforts to help the federal government avoid a default on the full faith and credit of the American economy, our work on saving the debt ceiling from time to time. And the second has been the work here, focusing on the ability to re-enable Congress to actually fulfill its Article 1 opportunity and obligation and invest some resources on things that they know and care most about. I want to thank Kevin Kosar and AEI for co-sponsoring this event, for all of the courageous partners who have worked together on this issue in ignominy for a number of years. So I just want to kind of set the stage, talk a little bit about brief history, and then I think the topics we're going to focus on today. So we are the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I'm here to tell you that bipartisanship produces the very best and the very worst legislation in American society. When, as is often the case, you have people of different ideologies, different points of view, different spiritual and political interests coming together around evidence-based work and having the courageous compromise, and that's the good stuff. From time to time, fearing for their political futures, you get a kind of herd mentality where the group of buffaloes just starts racing towards the cliff, creating a level of momentum that is ultimately impossible to stop. And that's what happened in 2011 when then Speaker Boehner and President Obama decided together to claim the kind of head fake mantle of fiscal responsibility and deprive the Congress of this very important tool. And I say head fake because smart folks, they know just as we do that earmarks, what they were known at the time, do not increase federal spending, that they just basically provide the Congress the capacity to spend a fraction of the federal budget as opposed to having the executive branch make all those choices. But it felt good. It felt like a claim of kind of fiscal sobriety and courage. So what happened over then the next decade is that deficits went to record highs. There was a decline in the confidence and competence of Congress, and things weren't really looking very well. So surprise, surprise, riding to the rescue, the most unlikely of heroes, the Bipartisan House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Woo! There you go. First time that's probably ever happened in public. So the Select Committee had two superpowers. The first was that it was powerless, right? It was an opportunity for people to come together and not, kind of alienate the committees and kind of sit down and really do some work together. The second was nobody knew what it was. I mean, could you come up with a more forgettable name for an exercise in strengthening the country? And again, that gave them the capacity to actually do some smart and courageous things. And in 2020, they came out with a set of recommendations. Among them was a thoughtful effort to revise in significant ways the earmark process, consistent with a lot of the recommendations that speakers here today made. And over the last 2 years, we've had robust participation from both sides of the aisle, working on now what we understand to be community project funding. Give a lot of credit to the incoming House conference for voting to maintain this tool under what could have been quite a bit of public pressure. Very smart for them to do it very quickly. And so here we are. So earmarks are dead. Long live community project funding. Just want to kind of mention two things as we set the stage for the conversation. We're going to talk a lot about just the balance of power in what has been described as kind of the incredibly shrinking Congress over the last several decades. Weakening Congress has been an inside job, right? Most of the ways in which Congress has lost its authority and diminished its capability have been ways that they have actually undermined their own institutional integrity or kind of averted their eyes from hard choices. Things like whether the country should declare war and other things that the Congress used to take a lot of responsibility for. But so we're going to explore how directed congressional spending really matters, how it engages members, how it creates some incentive to participate in the legislative process. I will just share a quick story. I was talking to a pretty junior member of Congress from the Cleveland-ish area after earmarks came back, and just asked them, what is this important to you? And she said, this is the only thing that I'm known for. Like my constituents do not know who I am, right? I got elected, I came to Congress, I got put on a, kind of backwater committee. I basically have to vote with leadership just about all the time. And the ability to engage in something that I ran on. And, this is not specific to this member, but, the ability to work on, opioid addiction, the ability to address issues around veterans' health access, to strengthen the capacity to land planes at a reasonably small regional airport. This is how my constituents know me. And I think that really says a lot about what a representative democracy is supposed to be about. So we're going to talk about that. We are also going to talk about this evolving process. It is reasonable that people were cynical about the earmarks process around 2010 because it went off the rails. And a lot of examples of some pretty stupid projects, actually a little bit of like illegality and corruption. And so, it needed to be fixed. And there's been a lot done to fix it. So I think we're going to spend some time talking with now 2 years of experience about what's happened. What has been the disclosure, the deliberation, the review, the audit process that we think has now strengthened this fundamental mechanism. And I will just close with the personal reflection that this is the most scrutinized 0.3% of federal spending that has ever existed in the U.S. economy or budget. And so I think it is important to recognize that this is good work that's going to matter, I think, a great deal, not just for the capacity of individual members, but really for the collective strength of the institution. And so with that, I turn it over to my friend Kevin to lead the first panel.
All right, thank you, Jason. Well, good morning. I'm Kevin Kosar, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. This first panel kicks off our discussion of congressionally directed spending with a particular focus on community project funding grants. That's a bit of a mouthful, and you'll forgive us for occasionally using earmarks as a synonym because it's just easier to say, but they're different. So congressionally directed spending, this new form that we know as community project funding grants, was created fairly recently and was explicitly designed to replace the old system of earmarks that had been somewhat mothballed and had fallen into political disfavor. On this panel, I want to have us discuss with some specificity what these grants are, what's the process for getting them. We'll also take a look at what grants have been requested, what have been approved from last year and this year, and also compare the new grant process to the old way of doing business. The roadmap for this panel is straightforward. We'll have a presentation by one of our panelists who will kind of put out a lot of facts and figures for you all to think about. And then the panelists will chat a bit, and then we'll take audience questions. We'll take them from audience sitting here, but we'll also take them for those who are watching online. And if you're watching online, you could submit your question at any point during the panel via the YouTube chat. There's a live chat box you'll see. Or you can send them in via Twitter and just use the hashtag #BPC Live, sorry. We'll take as many as we can before we conclude the panel at 10:45. Now let me briefly introduce my three fellow panelists. Their biographies are long and august, but nonetheless, the time is short. First, on my left, Zach Corser is a professor at Claremont McKenna College and a fellow at BPC's Democracy Project. Zach co-leads his college's Policy Lab and is the editor of the volume Parchment Barriers, Political Polarization, and the Limits of Constitutional Order. Next, Molly Reynolds, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Reynolds studies Congress and the budget process and wrote a very highly regarded book on the Senate titled Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate. So she knows procedure, she knows budget. Molly also, I should mention, supervises the maintenance and publication of vital statistics on Congress, Brookings' terrific resource on the first branch of government. Last, but certainly not least, we have Mark Strand. Mark has spent many, many years in this town and spent many, many years on Capitol Hill and spent many, many years working with Capitol Hill, which is not to say that he's long in the tooth. Actually, he is. Let's be honest. He's the president of the Congressional Institute, a not-for-profit corporation dedicated to helping members of Congress better serve their constituents. and also to helping their constituents better understand their Congress. Mark is also the co-author of the volume Surviving Inside Congress, a guide for prospective, new, and not so new congressional staff. It's a very good book. Now, to start the discussion, let's turn first to Dr. Corser, to discuss the basics of the community project funding grants. Take it away.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, everyone, and good morning. I've got 10 minutes to talk about an hour's worth of information, so buckle your seatbelts. I'll do my best here, and I'm going to press the forward button. There's a lot to talk about, like I said. Kevin and I actually wrote a white paper for AEI recommending that Congress bring back a reformed process for earmarking in 2021 in February. And Congress listened, and within months, they enacted a new system called Congressionally directed spending. We've community grant projects, project funding in the House. It's styled differently between the two chambers. We may again use earmark from time to time. I don't have time to talk about all the aspects of the new reform process, but my presentation will focus in on, first off, transparency. And I think the thing that proves transparency is that I'm able to give you this level of detail about how every one of these projects was requested and spent upon. There's some improvements that could be made to make this stuff more accessible, but by and large, the fact that I'm even giving you this presentation sort of demonstrates the availability of the information, which is unprecedented given the previous process. One of the big changes that happened between fiscal year 22 and 23, I'll be making some comparisons between the two to show you how the process has evolved, is that in the House of Representatives, one of the important reforms that they made is capping the number of requests for every member. It was capped at 10. This year it's capped at 15, and we'll see that it had an effect on the number of requests and the amount of spending. And largely in this presentation, again, I've mentioned transparency. I'll be talking about how spending priorities have changed markedly from the old earmarking process to this process today. I'll be talking about differences between the chambers in terms of distribution, how these monies are spent between the states, and the role that the Appropriations Committee plays. One of the complaints against the old process was that appropriators had too much influence over this. And so we'll be testing that hypothesis looking at the House and the Senate. I'll just move on here quickly. So in fiscal year 23, we saw a big rise here in the number of requests, also, and in the amount of spending requested in the House of Representatives. Again, I think there's two things that we can attribute that to. One, of course, is that the cap was raised by 5. The second is that I think the Appropriations Committees and members really did a great job rolling out a process that had been moribund for 10 years. Many members, as was demonstrated by BPC, had never been in Congress when there was a system of earmarking. So there was a very quick ramp up in fiscal year 22. We've had a little more than a year now, to think about this process, and I think members are now sort of getting into the rhythm of this in terms of identifying projects, in terms of getting that extra boost in terms of 5 more requests. And so I think the volume of spending and the number of requests sort of reflect a House and a Senate who are now more comfortable, who understand this process, and in the House have more requests to make. So in terms of participation, there was actually a fairly lopsided vote that happened in the House conference to affirm keeping earmarks for a second fiscal year. But we haven't seen a huge boost in terms of GOP participation. It's at 60% more or less this year. That's a rise of 2% over fiscal year 22. But by and large, I would say the numbers are pretty static about participation. But I think we should keep an eye on fiscal year 24 after this vote in the caucus to see that Republicans might become more interested and feel like sort of the coast is clear. This process has proved itself politically and institutionally, and I hope to see that number go up. In terms of the amount of spending, it's gone up markedly. If you look at the amount approved, it's gone up to 107% in the House of Representatives. And if you look at the break, and I think this is true of the pre-moratorium period of earmarks. There was a decision made at the appropriations level about sort of the split, the divide that was going to be made between the majority and the minority. And that split, as you can see, happens to work out to 60-40. It's pretty clear that that's the decision-making process in appropriations. And that was pretty much true last year. It was 58-42, let's call it 60-40. That's the split. But you'll see that total spending is $8.7 billion in terms of the amount approved. The approval rates, both for deciding on projects and the amount that's approved, have remained relatively the same. And this number, again, we have to remember one of the big changes that was made is an agreement and a budget cap of 1% of discretionary spending. So As I'll show you on one of the last slides, this is so much less money being spent on earmarks than was spent in the old process. Looking at requests by subcommittee, transportation dominates. It dominated last year. It dominated this year in both chambers. And I think it's really interesting and reflective of this new process that individual members are looking at the needs of their districts, and it seems to be infrastructure, particularly as related to transportation, is a priority across the country. And this is a marked shift from the priorities of earmarks before the moratorium period. Again, I'll show you on the last slide. It was heavily skewed towards defense. Here you can see defense is actually at the bottom of the list. And when I get to the Senate, you'll see there's actually no monies approved for defense. In second place is labor and health and human services. You can see that Democrats tend to prefer health and human services in terms of both the requests and the number of approvals. There's a marked difference in some ways. There's overlap on transportation, but as you get further down the list, Republicans, for example, as you can see here, have more of a preference for energy and water. Democrats have more of a preference for labor and health and human services. I think this is an important point to say that while both chambers and both parties may have agreement about this as a process, they don't necessarily have the same priorities for spending. And I think it's important to allow each party, whether you're in the majority or the minority, to make those decisions on their own. There are going to be divergences. This has been shown in the pre-moratorium period too, that parties just differ on that kind of spending. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense for the majority to dictate to the minority how this is done. I think it de-emphasizes how this is an institutional mechanism, that it's in the individual responsibility of legislators to make these decisions for their district and be held accountable for them, not to have that dictated by an appropriator or someone in leadership. Comparing fiscal year 22 and 23, you can see that spending has gone up basically across the board. Priorities seem relatively similar. Both parties continue to be most interested in transportation and health and housing and urban development. Differ, again, energy and water for Republicans, and also military construction in the VA versus labor and health and human services for Democrats. So now looking at some of the distribution here. Now this is just by state. This is not per capita, but just sort of looking at overall spending. You can see that there are 4 states that without any participating members this year: Alaska, Montana, North and South Dakota. Distribution that you see here reflects the size of the delegation and population. If you just look at it by state, unsurprisingly, California leads, followed by Florida, Texas, New York, and Illinois. It's really driven by the size. But if we do this by a per capita basis, things change a little bit. We can see that now Florida ranks the highest, but you have to remember that Florida has no Senate requests. Both senators from Florida declined to participate in this process in fiscal year 23. So I'll show you a slide later where we combine spending in both chambers and see things kind of even out for some of those higher approval rates per capita that we see in certain states. But by and large, I would say, with few exceptions, the House and their rules and approach with the cap on 15 requests has had a salubrious effect on equality in terms of distribution throughout the country. There's some variations, but we can also attribute some of those variations, although more studies are required, to say that maybe there are shifting priorities. Maybe there's a large infrastructure project in one state that might get approved for a particular earmark one year. Maybe another state might have similar needs, but just not quite as expensive. So there may be some explanations for that. Looking at the role of appropriators to see if they had an outsized advantage, both in terms of the amount of money or the number of requests that got approved. And in the House of Representatives, that's just not the case. Appropriators actually, in some regards, are slightly lower in their averages than is the sort of normal rank and file members. So I think the House of Representatives, again, has done a really positive job in terms of a reform process that gives each member sort of equal access to directed spending. Now let's look at the Senate. Senate differs. They don't have this cap at 15 requests. And so senators can make as many requests as they want. And as you can see in the number of requests that they make and the amount that they make, it's much higher than the House of Representatives. They still have, though, the 1% cap on discretionary spending. Discretionary spending. So they're still under the same financial limits, but they're not under the same kind of request limits that the House of Representatives has. But otherwise, they have similar reforms in virtually every other regard. So if you look at Senate requests by party, one of the things about the Senate is that you might remember the Senate Republican Conference declined to remove a prohibition against earmarks from their rules. What they did is basically said, well, you don't have to pay so much attention to that particular rule. If you would actually like to make a request, we're not going to hold you to it, but we're not going to take it out of the rules. And this has had a chilling effect, I think, to some degree, and raised a kind of bar politically for Republican members to participate. And as a consequence, only about a third of Republicans in the Senate participate. And this contributes, I think, to some lopsided outcomes in terms of distributional effects between party and also between states, as we'll talk about. So you can see the number of requests and the amount requested has gone up from fiscal year 22. Again, I think this has something to do with the process sort of, being online, as it were. Much lower approval rate, which is sort of in the Senate, which I think just reflects the higher volume of requests and the amount requested in the Senate. But again, numbers are sort of up across the board. You notice that this partisan split in the Senate is different than it is in the House. And this may reflect a more bipartisan approach to this process, or the fact that it was an even 50-50 split. And so, sort of by necessity, the split between parties would be narrower than in the House. Request by subcommittee. Looking at this, you can see that the priorities are only slightly different than in the House of Representatives, but the amount of requests doubles that of the House. There's a big difference in terms of not limiting the number of requests. Senators ask for a lot, even though they get about half as much in return. Interior is second in the Senate, and it's fourth in the House. Maybe this has to do with statewide projects and the fact that senators are more interested in interior requests than the House of Representatives is. No defense accounts open for directed spending in the Senate. They don't approve anything. So this, obviously has an effect on the amount of defense spending that comes from earmarks. So yeah, more requests means a lower chance of success. It's only about 20%. I kept the y-axis the same here in terms of spending, so you can see how little was approved compared to how much was requested. So there's a lot more churning through these requests in the Senate than is in the House, and again, a more equitable split. And you can see spending actually priorities in terms of what was approved pretty even throughout the Senate, much more so than in the House. Partisan preferences are not as strong in the Senate. And then comparison of 22 and 23 in terms of spending, things seem up across the board. Increases in requested funding in all categories except financial services. Preferences are similar between parties about transportation, interior, labor, military construction, and energy. So now we talk about the distribution. This is just by population. You can see already there are 12 states without participating senators, all of whom are GOP. I take that back. There's a couple of Democrats, excuse me. But nonetheless, this creates a kind of lopsided outcome. If you think about the country as a whole, there are so many more senators that are not participating. And so as a consequence, there's a skew here in a number of ways towards appropriators and towards states that have members both in the Senate and the House that want to participate. And so you can see spending doesn't reflect the state population. You've got some winners here up front with Alaska, Oklahoma, Hawaii, Alabama, Missouri. California ranks sixth, even just looking at it by state. If we do this by a per capita, it becomes even more exaggerated. You can see that Alaska is the leader in the clubhouse. This is even without the participation of Don Young, who unfortunately was deceased and could not have any requests. This is all Lisa Murkowski. And you can see that on the top end here, it's a lot of appropriators. As I'll sort of show you, appropriators do very well in this process in the Senate. There's some reasons for this, I think. It has to do with the fact that many of the appropriators that are on the Republican side of the committee are eager participants in this process, whereas many of their colleagues choose not to participate. So, if you don't ask for anything, you don't get. And the appropriators are asking. They're more comfortable with this process. And as a consequence, it's really sort of throwing things off a bit in terms of distribution. If we look at it overall, let's combine the House and the Senate and look at overall directed spending in fiscal year 23. A couple things happen. One of the things is there's actually only 2 states that get 0 participation, Montana and North Dakota. They get 0 directed spending because none of their delegation participates. But by and large, you can see that for the most part, the distribution is fairly even except on the high end. And I think it's the Senate that's throwing this off. You've got Alaska way ahead. If you put Florida and Texas and combine it into an average, you see that they go sort of the middle of the pack. They're no longer looking on the high end of things. But we've got some states that really stand out. I don't have time to talk about that. So comparing to pre-moratorium earmarks, you can see that spending and priorities have changed dramatically. If you look at the average of earmark spending from 2008 to 2010, military construction and VA, energy and water dominate. And now you can see that they don't at all. It's the new priorities are transportation, labor, health and human services, and education. And again, I think this reflects a changed process. At the risk of sounding normative, I think these actually reflect local preferences rather than national ones. And I think it's a demonstration that of the program working as intended. So some conclusions. In the House, broad participation continued between both chambers and both parties. GOP rules still undermine broad participation in the Senate. That hasn't changed. There were changes on the House side. Requests increased 57%. Funding increased 107%. But like I said, I think that's because the process is online. Still much less spending than the old system. Changed spending priorities. A starker partisan split on the House side. And not much of an appropriator's advantage, really none. Generally equitable distribution, that's very different on the Senate side. While they have a more equitable partisan divide, we can see that there's continued equity concerns sort of about distribution. If you think about appropriators, if you think about overrepresented states and uneven participation, it seems like the Senate could maybe do more to think about this sort of distributional effect and how they can maybe modify their rules to try to correct for that. But it'll be a very hard thing to do until Republican senators, I think, are more involved in this process and more committed to the idea of directed spending. So I don't know where I was on 10 minutes there, but I did my best.
Well done, well done. Lots of material there. Thank you for doing that. Molly, let me turn to you. You've been watching this earmark or community grants process as it's been developed and unfold. You've heard Zach's presentation. You're a budget process expert, you're a procedure expert, you're a Congress expert. What stands out to you? What do you think is worthy of notice about
Yeah, excuse me. So let me start by just, first thing I want to do is underline something Zach actually mentioned, which is the degree to which our ability to talk about this data at this level of specificity is itself a real achievement of the new regime, if you will, the new approach to distributing funding for specific projects to communities around the country. And so that alone is a really big shift, and I think a really important one for restoring the faith both of people inside the chamber and Americans across the country that this process is unfolding in a sort of transparent and deliberative way. So I'll start there. Second thing I'll say is I was really struck by, Zach reflected a little bit on the differences that we saw between the House and the Senate, particularly in the level of Republican participation. And I would venture that, to go back to kind of one of the things that Jason was talking about in his introduction, that for House members of both parties, where so much power is now centralized in the hands of party leaders, securing funding for projects in their communities through this program, through this approach to distributing funding, is just much more important for House members who are seeking to kind of build reputations with their constituents than it might be for senators. So, if you are a senator, your name recognition among the people who vote for you is probably much higher to begin with than for House members. And so I think, again, particularly in the current House of Representatives, where members often feel like they don't have a lot of agency in what happens, this is a really important tool for members to accomplish things that are important to their communities, and also to really feel like they have skin in the game in the legislative process, to really sort of put in the effort to learn how to do this well. And then the last thing I'll say is really just sort of a question for thinking about what else we can learn from this data going forward. So Zach talked a little bit about the way in which the distribution of earmarks across policy areas is different, and sort of appropriations bills is different now than it was in the pre-moratorium period. And one thing that I'm excited about the ability to dig into with this kind of data that we now have is how much does that reflect kind of other changes in federal spending priorities? Is it the case that part of why we're seeing, say, more transportation projects, more labor HHS projects is because there's this desire to sort of catch up on places where there was maybe less other kinds of spending in the interim. I don't know, but that again is the kind of thing that we can now do with this information to help us enhance our broader understanding of Congress.
All right, thank you. Mark, you know, of course, that the GOP has been a very divided mind about these for some years. One example is that we have two senators from Alaska, Murkowski and Sullivan, and Ms. Murkowski participates in the earmarking process, and Mr. Sullivan does not. Can you speak to the kind of divided GOP mind on this, and where they are now, and what should we make of the fact that when the new House majority met a few weeks ago, overwhelmingly voted to retain or to at least not adopt a prohibition on participating in the community grants process?
Thanks, Kevin. I think one of the most interesting things is that, to me, the whole process of directing spending is a very Republican idea. One, it's constitutional, that Congress is supposed to have a constitutional responsibility. Two, it's a basic question. Who do you want determining what gets spent in your district, the administration or you? And so a transparent process, I always say if you're not willing to put out a press release on it, you shouldn't do it, which in the old days, it used to be a lot of secret ones. But also it's very practical for Republicans. Many of them represent rural districts. They don't have big grant writers, like the big cities do, New York, Los Angeles. They have whole teams that can write grants, and the rural areas don't have these resources. But members of Congress can get this money funded for them. Second, I think another point of this is that probably the appropriation process with a chair like Kay Granger gave them a little confidence that there's not going to be a lot of prolific spending, but it'll be kept down. We won't have add-ons instead of direct spending of existing programs, which I think is a very important part of that. And the other thing, being a close majority, is that they're going to need help passing some of these bills. One of the most important things about Congress lately is they don't legislate. Very few legislate. But now this process allows them to legislate again. The difficult thing is when you're in the minority, if you get a directed project in your district, it's kind of hard to vote against that appropriation bill. The campaign commercial practically writes itself. You can't take credit for it. So it encourages bipartisan majorities for appropriation bills. And then finally, for a lot of these freshmen, given the fact that the Senate is Democrat and the administration is Democrat, some of their only accomplishments in the system are going to be things they get done this process in the appropriation bills, which must pass. So to me, it was a no-brainer that they did this. The new process being so much more transparent, that everything is spelled out in black and white, it's part of the record, it's codified in law, I think it will increase the comfort level, and I think we'll see Republican participation go up this year.
All right. We are right at 10:40, and I want to use this moment to ask our audience if you have any questions for the panel or on the data you have seen. You, sir, go ahead.
Jack Fitzpatrick with Bloomberg Government. Professor Corser, you did the House and Senate comparison. How would you characterize on transparency of the available information between the House and Senate? And if there's any difference, do you all have any recommendations for either one?
Oh, yes. There were some very tired undergraduates who were going through a lot of PDFs to try to put this information for me together to analyze. So there's a difference between availability and accessibility. And I think on the front end with requests, the House does probably the best job. They just put out an Excel spreadsheet. It's just all there. The Senate puts it up on their website, and it's all on member websites too. But in terms of a centralized resource, the Senate just puts it up on the web, so you've got to scrape the web to get all of this information. But really, the worst part is on approvals. Like this isn't law yet. These are just what the appropriators have decided they're going to approve. And in the Senate, this is all on PDFs, which is really difficult. It lacks information. It's really difficult to merge this with names. I mean, it's just not. It's a bit clunky. And I think it's reflective of sort of a work product that they're used to. I don't think it's an intention to mislead or make things difficult. But I do think there's more work that could be done to sort of make this clearer, more palatable. But I will say also, if you wait long enough, as we'll probably talk about, I think, in the next panel, the GAO is doing a really great job in terms of tracking the spending once it actually becomes law. They have a really detailed series of reports about all the different spending bills and all the different earmarks within them. That does help to make this more transparent, even more transparent. But I would say that yes, the House and the Senate could put this in a much more user-friendly format for those of us that want to get a sort of overall lay of the land.
All right, we have a question from online. If defense earmarks have essentially vanished, has the process of earmarking defense projects moved to the NDAA? Who would like to handle that one?
The audience response, yes. I mean, I would just say quickly one thing. One thing that we didn't mention so far is that one of the biggest changes from the old system is no more earmarks for for-profit entities. And so the spending priorities have shifted away from defense, I think, and that's one of the reasons why it's shifted towards local priorities. You know, this has to be nonprofits, counties, local needs, and I think that's reflected in the shift too. Defense lobbying and sort of the pressure on legislators to use these for defense has really subsided, and I think maybe it's gone in different directions, but I can't really say so much about where.
I think you also have to point out that one of the most egregious abuses was Representative Cunningham, which was mostly earmarking in the black budget, which was completely invisible to people and was rather blatant in terms of its abuse. So I think maybe defense in particular, because of that reason, wants to stay away from it as much as possible for the time being. It may change in the future, but for now, I think they are content to let the other committees do the congressionally directed spending.
Very good.
Just a comment on that. When I worked in Congress, the Defense Department had something called the unfunded priorities list. So when they didn't get it in the three bites of the apple, it came in later, and that was earmarked. And I wonder, that would be a really interesting thing to look at to see if the unfunded priorities list exists anymore, or if that's been put into, like the emergency spending for Iraq and Afghanistan just became another budget item. So it became the overseas, contingency operations account. So like, I think the money is definitely still there, but it's not being accessed the same way.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning it very briefly that during the sometimes called a ban on earmarks that existed for a decade or so, some call it moratorium, congressionally directed spending still happened. It happened in other ways. There were letter marking was another vehicle for doing it. There was phone marking where members of Congress would call up executive agencies and say, by the way, could you consider this project ahead of others, et cetera, et cetera. So the kind of desire to engage in that is kind of innate to being a legislator.
And we know that also when Congress loses power in this arrangement, the executive branch still directs the funding. My Brookings colleague, John Hudak, has worked quite a bit on this question of where presidents direct resources. And so we know the money is still going out the door. It's just going out the door in a way that's farther removed from the individuals who are most in tune with the needs of their communities.
Yes, it's no surprise that when presidents are running for re-election, particularly that the grants going out to states where that are swing states seem to get a bit more at the behest of the executive branch. Go ahead in the back, please.
Hi, thank you. This is a great panel. I'm Jeff Edelstein. So I have a question. I'm interested in earmarks, but I'm not an expert. So has there been any change? The public thinks that earmarks used to sort of grease the wheels to get legislation passed. Has it always been tied just to appropriations, or did it help with authorizing legislation? And am I correct that now, the way you're talking, it's only with appropriations?
That's a great question, and we don't have much time left. I'll try to answer it very quickly. So when Kevin and I wrote this report for AEI, one of the things that I did is I interviewed 10 former members of Congress, all of whom had participated either within appropriations or not in appropriations in the sort of pre-earmarks era and the moratorium era. And one of the things that I found on this question of the greasing the wheels was that it happened, but it was an exception. These were things that, happened sometimes. Sometimes the leadership would try to dangle a carrot on a vote, but it wasn't the standard. It actually was kind of, I won't say boring, but a kind of well-known process that there's going to be some amount of in the budget put aside for earmarking, that it would be divided between the majority and the minority, and that those parts of the appropriation committee would basically decide on who would get what. Now, politics could play a role in that, but for the most part, other than a kind of objection to appropriators having too much influence in that process in terms of who got what. It wasn't this kind of top-down, greasing the wheels, we're the leadership and we're dictating how this is going to go. I don't think it really worked that way. I think that was much more the exception than the rule.
Thank you.
Another thing I would add to that is that it's interesting how much fewer authorization bills passed once the
Yes.
moratorium went into effect.
Yes.
And to a large degree, that was an incentive to get these bills passed. And it used to be that the House would enforce its rules that you can't appropriate anything that hasn't been authorized. So all the more reason they should go back to doing
And
authorizations as well.
I think the important way to think about this is there's a difference between greasing the wheels in the form of do you get individual people to vote for it because you give them earmarks versus greasing the wheels in terms of is there an incentive to do the thing at all because collectively folks want to get their projects out of the process. So I think, right now, like literally as we speak, we're having this debate over whether there's going to be an omnibus versus a full year CR. And one consideration in that debate is whether everyone will get their earmarks. And so that's a different question from sort of what Zach was talking about. And I completely agree about getting individual members at the margins to vote for something.
Well, all right. Regrettably, we are just past time at 10:47 and we have to make space for the next panel to step up. So, Zach, Molly, Mark, thank you very much. Let's go.
I think we're going to get started with panel 2. Again, thanks everyone for being here. And I think we had a good discussion with the first panel about some of the data, some of the numbers, some of the discussion about the politics of this issue. We're going to take this second panel and focus a lot more on digging into the process and what has happened over the 117th Congress. We have some great representatives here who can help us talk through what it was like to be on the inside as a congressional staff member, learn a little bit more about some of the reforms, the technology issues, talk a little bit more about some of the accountability questions that have come up, and just really learn about this process that got restarted after there was a 10-year moratorium. Fully getting into some of the questions, maybe about some of the improvements that could be made and some of the reforms. So I'd like to just briefly do a quick introduction of the colleagues on the stage here. Immediately to my left is Brittany Madney. She's a Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Representative Ashley Hinson, as a Republican from Iowa. Brittany's worked on the House side for more than 10 years in a couple of different capacities. But basically, Brittany's been a key lead in her office for a member who's a freshman and was on the Appropriations Committee. And they definitely dived into the congressional project funding and have some great examples of their experience. Next to her is Ann Meeker. She's the Director of Special Projects at PopVox Foundation. PopVox has really been at the intersection of civic engagement and a lot of the questions about innovation and working with Congress on how to sort of improve its processes. She previously worked in leading constituent services for Representative Seth Moulton from Massachusetts. Following is Lars Schoenander, and he's a policy technologist at Lincoln Network. Lincoln is another civil society organization among many of us here who have really been on the forefront of the free market questions and getting into the innovation issues and technology, and Lincoln has really been a lead on that. And Lars can give us a little bit of insight more about some of the questions about technology and about innovation and how that can play into this process. And then finally, we have Allison Bodwin. She's a director at the Government Accountability Office. Allison has a home team, but has been a co-lead for this new project, following up on Congress's call for some follow-up after these member requests have been enacted. And she can give us a little bit more insight on what the GAO has done since the March and the enactment of the fiscal year 22 appropriations. So I really appreciate you being here. So first of all, I'd like to ask Brittany, first of all, thanks for being here and taking a little time off from the House side. Maybe you can tell us what's going on this week and the challenges. But in a bigger picture, you have a very unique perspective from the standpoint of you're in a personal office. The House side decided to bring these back after a decade. What was it like from your experience starting up a new process, your boss's experience, how you engaged constituents, how you worked with the committee? What were some of the challenges you saw? What were some of the results from your office potentially, and how you continue to work through that? What do you see in the 118th Congress? House Republicans had a conversation about this and decided to keep them, and maybe your boss was involved in that kind of conversation. And what do you see if there's any additional changes that may come about with the House continuing them, but making some additional reforms? So lots of questions. Love to hear what you have.
Well, first of all, Franz, thank you for hosting this, for inviting me to participate. I think that it's such an important conversation that we have not only in general, but now as we're making that transition into the 118th Congress. We're going into a period where a lot of uncertainty is afoot with spending, congressional spending in general, and it's important that everyone is at the table, everyone is having these conversations. I think it's awesome that both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol are engaging, so it's not just bipartisan, it's bipartisan and bicameral, and that's the only way that we can really move forward in an effective way and make sure that we're advocating for taxpayers. So with that, I will preface this by saying you will hear this word from me once, earmarks, and you will not hear it from me again, because we are not talking about that. We are talking about what our office calls CPFs. That's community project funding. Other offices may use other terms. People who were here the last time that these things were in play may use other terms, but there is a reason that we call them CPFs, and it is because the CPFs today are not the same thing, the same process, the same type of funding even as the earmarks of old. So I want to lay the ground now. You'll hear me use the CPF term. The reason I'm using it is because we truly embrace that in our office. We embrace that in the Appropriations Committee. These are ways for Congress, for members of Congress who are closest to the people they are representing, to get funding to community projects, hence community project funding. So I think that leads into one of your questions, Franz, about what's different, why are they back, how has this changed? Massive changes in oversight, massive changes in transparency and accountability. You can't just sort of throw a dart at a board and hope that it's going to land on some big funding for your district. These days, there's a very careful process in place. I think most offices who have engaged with the CPF process now will tell you that there's a lot of staff work on the front end of this process that makes sure that there is transparency and accountability. One rule that we use is if you wouldn't be excited and your member wouldn't be excited for a project to be on the front page of a local newspaper, you shouldn't be engaging in that project. And I think that helps keep taxpayers confident in this process, and it helps keep offices accountable. Huge part of that accountability is the transparency requirements now. So you had mentioned asking about what we're doing, what some of our successes have been. I can tell you about those, but I can also point you to henson.house.gov and have you go look at our webpage that says what Ashley Henson has submitted for CPFs, not only this year, but the previous year, because we have an archive up there as well. And that's a requirement. Our office actually goes above and beyond, provides more information than is required to engage in this process. We think it's really important that we put as much information out for the public as possible. But every office has to put some information. One piece of information that we share is sort of our foundational basics, right? Who the project is, what the project is, who's the money going to, how much did she request, the address of that project, so you can see and verify that it's either in the district or has a clear district impact, and a short summary of that project. We also have to share a financial disclosure statement certifying that my boss, my member of Congress for whom I work, does not have any financial interest in this project, nor does her family. That's new. None of this was there in the past. I think that really changes the way that staff and members approach these projects. It's also changing the way communities are approaching the projects, because they can now see the success that happened previously and sort of take a look at that and say, oh, okay, well, Congresswoman Henson got some significant funding for a firehouse in Protivin, Iowa, a community of about 200 people, and they were never going to be able to get funding without this. I'm a small town sheriff or police department, and I don't think I'm going to be eligible for a Department of Justice grant without some help. If she could do it for Protivin, maybe she can do it for me, right? And for us, it's really about being a voice for those communities that do not have another option or opportunity, right? If we're talking about Protivin, they don't have a professional grant writer. They don't even have a professional fire department. They have a volunteer fire department, and they're responsible for taking care of their community and many of the surrounding communities. It's all ag land. If one of those fields goes up, everything is destroyed. This regional economy is set back an incredible amount. When they came to us for a project request, we couldn't really understand the request that they had written, so we asked them to send us a video. You know, can you send us a video? Show us what kind of construction you're asking us for. What do you mean your fire trucks don't go inside? And so they said, okay. So all the volunteer firefighters got together and they filmed a video on somebody's phone, and they showed us you cannot get in the truck while having your gear on. So someone has to remove their gear, back the truck out, which, by the way, the door doesn't close if the truck's in because the current station was too small. Back the truck out, then put your gear back on, then load back into the truck. And someone has to go manually close the door so that the fire station isn't open, and then they could proceed. So they were telling us this could be 5-6 minutes. That's a life that could be lost. That's property damage in rural Iowa where you may never get that back. It's an entire community. And so we saw this video and we thought, oh my gosh, we're gonna fight for these guys. Like, we've got to do it. And for Ashley, you know, once we'd gone through sort of our process of validating the project, which I'll talk about in a little bit, once they had cleared that process for her, this was sort of emblematic of what a CPF should be. It's a small town, but it's a core function of government. It is a good, reliable use of taxpayer dollars. We can see for ourselves where the money is going to be spent. We're potentially helping this community of volunteer firefighters save lives, and we're knowing that they don't have the resources to ask the federal government for a grant in any other way. They don't have a professional grant writer. No hate to Chicago or San Francisco or Miami or New York, but those big cities have professional grant writers. They can engage with the federal government in a meaningful way outside of the CPF process. If they want to engage through it, that's great, that's up to their members, but my boss doesn't represent any of those big cities. She represents tiny towns in rural Iowa, and she represents Cedar Rapids and Dubuque and Waterloo, which by Iowa standards are pretty significant cities. We love them and are thrilled with them, but even they have challenges when they're up against Chicago. And so for us, this is a way to go into those communities, say, what is it that you need? What are you already eligible for, but don't know how to walk along this process? How can we help you get there? This is not new money. We're not giving anyone new money. It's already money that's going to be appropriated through these programs that are largely already agreed upon and bipartisan. We just want our small communities like Protivin to have a fair shot. Give them a chance at getting through this process that is incredibly complex, incredibly bureaucratic, and we can be the ones that assist them through that. So that's sort of a quick overview of why we've engaged in this process, how we decided to make the decision to engage. And I think moving into the 118th, thinking through the oversight measures already in place so that good projects like the Protivin Firehouse can move forward, but bad projects, problematic projects, projects where there may be corruption at play don't move forward is really important. I think the measures that we have put in place now are great, and I do believe that we can only strengthen those going forward.
Okay, great, thanks. And I'd like to ask Ann a little bit more, and Ann, you also worked in the House. You know, this has been a new process, and Brittany brings up an example of an office that was very actively engaged and really embraced this, but many members are new, so 58% of the Senate and 70% of the House were new since all this had been in place since a 10-year moratorium. So new members, new staff in personal offices and committees, constituents from small local government to NGOs who had staff who had left. So sort of a massive sort of education campaign, and sort of PopVox has kind of been at the forefront of that. But can you talk a little bit more about the type of things that you did and the PopVox Foundation did in terms of resource guides and engagement and trying to help people better understand this process now that it had been set up? And what do you see for things that offices that did well, offices that could make improvements, sort of kind of been there? So how did we fill in the gaps, and what could be done in the 118th Congress?
Yeah, absolutely, Franz, and thank you so much for your partnership on all of that work. It's certainly not sole credit to the PopVox Foundation, but we've been delighted to partner with BPC. So I'm really struck hearing about the Team Hinson process. So the PopVox Foundation really works on three buckets. So we work on capacity, we work on engagement, and we work on innovation. And earmarks are, excuse me,
CPFs.
CPFs. You'll have to forgive me, I'm not as disciplined on the new terms. CPFs are so interesting because they really are a microcosm where all three of these things come together. So hearing about the Hinson process, Brittany, how many hours did it take your team to get that process off the ground?
Oh, in total, well, I would say probably a good 30 hours a week if you add up the staff time for the first 4 or 5 weeks. And then following that first 4 or 5 weeks off the ground, certainly a good chunk of time after that, maybe 10 hours after that per week.
Which is just phenomenal considering how overstretched Congress is as a whole, how much Congress is just really struggling with staff capacity to do all of the demands that are laid on it. So when CPFs were announced, and the Senate equivalent as well, we really thought, and we came together with BPC to think, oh my goodness, this is such an exciting process, this is such an exciting opportunity, but the impact that this has on capacity is phenomenal. I mean, the amount of individual duplicative work that each office is working on to set up these processes, even offices that don't go as above and beyond to really make that an inclusive, transparent, accountable process, that's an incredible impact on the institution. So we teamed up with BPC to put together some basic manuals. Just if you are a new staffer, if you are a new office, how do you approach this? Where do you start? How should you vet a nonprofit? I certainly wouldn't know where to start on what is a 990, how do I find a 990, how do I figure out if you actually have a plan to spend down this money? How do I figure out if you know how much money you should be asking for? So we came together to do some of those manuals. So in the process of developing those manuals, really had the chance to kind of look at where are the pain points for staff, where is that capacity not being used effectively for the institution, because I think that's one of the big takeaways for me, that the process decisions from the committee have this overall impact on institutional capacity. And that really impacts how offices can carry out that engagement. So into the second bucket that we work on. As we mentioned, this is new for staff, this is new for requesters as well. So where offices don't have the capacity to do that really thoughtful, comprehensive outreach, the process favors organizations, it favors larger governments who have those grant writers, it favors the larger nonprofits, the university systems, the hospital systems that are familiar with the process, that maybe employed someone who worked in earmarks before the ban, CPFs before the ban, and knew what to look for and knew what to ask for and knew to call and say, I want to talk to your appropriate staff, or I want your form, how do I do this? So the capacity really translates into how can offices take advantage of this opportunity to have a better engagement process. I think there's so much potential in the way that CPFs work for offices to use that as an opportunity to bring constituents in, not just requesters, but bring in constituents to give input into this process. We were talking a bit before the panel how for many new offices this year, earmarks may be one of the few tangible things that they can show at the end of the year for their constituents that they've done. And so that's also one of the few opportunities for constituents to say, hey, I weighed in on something with my member of Congress where my voice had an impact. And we really did see some offices go above and beyond to develop engagement processes that brought constituents into that decision-making process, which was really exciting. We saw some offices really innovate in kind of proactive outreach to the community. So the late Representative Don Young, as soon as earmarks, CPFs, came back, sent out immediately a huge blast to his entire district, coincidentally his entire state, to say, earmarks are back. What do you want to see? as a community, as a member of my community, as a constituent here, what should I prioritize in my application process? What would make the most difference in your community? It's kind of proactive prioritizing from the community. On the back end, we saw representatives like Chris Pappas in New Hampshire, once they had all their applications in, open that back up to the community and say, which of these should we fund? How would these projects have an impact on you and on your life? Really interesting way to bring in community input there as well. We also saw offices, again, thinking about the capacity, find innovative ways to bring in their district staff. So really take advantage of those on-the-ground relationships and say, our DC team on appropriations may not know all of the teeny tiny nonprofits and the tiny little organizations and fire departments and police departments and self-defense studios who want to train sheriffs in nonviolent suspect control and de-escalation. That just may not rise to the level of DC. So how can we bring those into the fold? And then we also saw some offices, again, really innovate in transparency. So I know Rep. Kilmer, who's also the chair of the House Select Committee on Modernization, did some cool things where he published the criteria that his team was going to use to evaluate applications, really a step forward in transparency to say, if you apply and you don't get selected, here's why. You know what we're looking for in advance. So I think it's really encouraging to see the innovation in this space happen in individual offices. So for me, what I'm hoping for in the next year is to see more formalized ways of sharing those best practices among offices. We did see a lot of that for the committees. I think committee staff did an incredible job highlighting good examples from their members. I know we heard committee staff sharing forms around saying, hey, you're trying to build a form. This office has a really good one, or this office has run into problems when they try to ask a question like this, so maybe take a look at a different example. And I think that's where the whole institution can benefit as far as capacity, as far as innovation and engagement, is to say, to kind of raise the floor and say, here's the level that we're going to set as an institution. This is what no matter where you are in the country, if your member is participating in the CPF program, here's the baseline that you can expect as an applicant, as a constituent engaging in the process. So that's what I'm hoping to see a little bit more of that formalized and made available, especially to new members.
Great, thanks. And I'd like to ask Lars. Lars is a member of the Lincoln Network, been one of the really important civil society organizations that's been actively involved in the House modernization process, and your organization's been at the forefront of the technology and innovation questions. I mean, you hear a little bit from Ann and Brittany about just the projects that come forward and made requests, and it can be overwhelming to offices on that sort of input side and sort of processing all of that, and a lot of staff time comes into that. How does the committee process it? But can you tell us a little bit more about, first of all, maybe how the modernization committee sort of then influenced a little bit of the appropriations committee's decisions in terms of Article 1 authorities, but just really dig into some of the key technology questions to help with the staff capacity, both in the personal offices and the committee. Outside of that, how can we make improvements on that, and sort of how can we manage a lot of this, because this can be really overwhelming.
Sure, glad to be here, friends. Happy to talk about the more technical aspects of CPF reform, if we're not going to call it earmark reform anymore. So what we have right now, compared to what the ModCom committee came out with, I'd say is a moderate option. The no change option, what do we have? No earmarks. What I'd say would be the biggest change would be if we fully implemented what the ModCom proposal would have, which was essentially flipped how earmark, so to speak, would do on its head, where it would come directly from communities first and then go up in stages of approval, and only then reaching Congress at the very end. Instead, what happened is a lot of the transparency reforms got implemented, such as public-facing websites, public-facing data, criterion being made public. However, arguably that did not go far enough. So a problem facing members of civil society right now is a lot of the data is all over the place. So, for example, consider this. There's a earmarks website for every member of Congress, and those websites are being overwritten as we speak with the fiscal year 2023 earmarks. This makes it a little bit painful if one wants to figure out what they successfully used their CFP to spend last year on. On the data side, on the one hand, it's very good that the proposals were made into spreadsheets. What's not so good is that every single appropes got made into a PDF that's not formatted properly. If you looked at the PDF, the rows are not even properly formatted. It's like vertically, so you sort of have to shift your head a little bit to read it properly. I was recently informed by Allison that the reason the GAO has the data in the first place is some poor data scientist had to transcribe all these PDFs into a single spreadsheet that could then be properly analyzed. Who knows how many man hours that took compared to the data scientists being able to do their job. Well, I mean, this is their job, but they prefer to be doing data science instead of scraping. So on the technical side, there's room for improvement, such as building out APIs for this data instead of PDFs and strangely formatted spreadsheets. Having a single authority build a single website for this instead of members running their own websites. And this goes more broadly into Lincoln's work in Article 1 reform, because the power to actually disperse these funds is a part of Congress that has not been around for a while because of the controversies back in the early 2000s. So money that Congress could have been spending was spent by other entities. And just to jump into a bit of a future on this, while there's room and there's discussion on building up potential new interfaces for this data, at the moment it's unclear if any of these new technical implementations will be implemented, because simply there's limited capacity in Congress at the moment to do this type of technical work, because the person responsible for uploading those PDFs is one of a few IT people within Congress. So it's a difficult ask, but it needs to be asked if there's a better way to display this data, because frankly, there should be somebody who's doing this part-time, wrangling everybody into displaying this data properly, versus the sort of ad hoc systems, because the websites for the committee, for the appropes, are not even standardized as well, which can also be seen on the committee websites, but that's a different story.
Yeah. And so while it's been a vast improvement to get it in somewhat of a centralized place, it's still, as you said, very ad hoc by individual offices, by the committee putting it up in the form that it has, and then for all these outside groups like ours to be able to try to look at it and interpret it. Yeah. Thanks. That's really important commentary. One of the improvements, one of the additional transparency measures that was put in place for the first time, both mentioned by the House Modernization Committee and then picked up by the Appropriations Committees, was to ask a key entity, an independent entity, to look at these requests after they had been enacted. And so that was requested for fiscal year 22, and then we anticipate will be in place for fiscal year 23. So Allison is director and has co-led the effort within the Government Accountability Office to do that. And this is great. I mean, we really appreciate you being here and be able to talk about it, because it's probably something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. It's the first time this has existed to look back after enactment. There's always been these questions about what happened to all those tens of thousands of member requests over the past years. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what did the first requests were enacted with March and FY22 Omnibus? What did the GA do? How did you get started? Kind of how are you organized? What have you been able to put out publicly so far? You have a web portal tracking the funds. Tell us a little bit more about that. What are you looking at doing down the road, and sort of how do you see it coming together? You talked to the Appropriations Committee, and you also were talking to the agencies who received the funds. So just lots of key questions about what GAO has done and what can we see coming forward in the coming
Thank
future.
you so much for having me today. I appreciate it. And there's a lot that my colleagues on the panel have said that resonates with the work that GAO has done, so I hope to be able to touch on that. As you noted, our role really starts after appropriations passage. So very interesting to hear all about the congressional processes leading up to that, and the technical support provided to potential recipients of these funds. So we really came in at the point after bill passage, and for FY22, we were asked to do two things. The first was to assist the appropriations committees with FY23, and sort of look at the process and think about how it went and if there are changes or observations we could make that would help the process improve going forward. And the second thing was to sample projects for FY22 and look at actually how those projects are performing. So to date, we've really focused on the first part, which was supporting the FY23 process. And the primary reason for taking that approach is because with the length of the continuing resolution, we didn't have a strong expectation that there would be very much progress on actually executing these projects during FY22. We're hopeful that, in particular for those that received 1-year funding authority, that the money would at least get obligated to those projects, but it takes some time. So we focused on supporting the Congress for FY23, and that really put our focus on the 18 agencies that were executing these funds. In some cases, the agencies are spending the funds themselves, but in most cases, the money is being distributed through existing grant programs or other financial assistance mechanisms to state and local governments, tribal, territorial governments, as well as nonprofit organizations and higher education organizations. And so we went out, we kind of dispatched GAO to all of the 18 agencies that received these funds. And on our Tracking the Funds website, we published 19 reports between September and October, one for each of the agencies and another that was sort of a national kind of summary report, as well as a downloadable data set that anybody can grab and look at the universe of projects that were funded through the House and Senate processes. And so going forward, we're beginning to develop our sampling mechanisms now for looking at progress on those FY22 projects. We're also undertaking a bit of a more significant data review, and my colleague Tom is sitting right here and is nodding along, so I know I'm not saying anything off base. But that data review that we're looking at is, can we use available data sources, either through something like USA Spending or from Access GAO has in working with agencies to obtain data from their financial systems, to examine the universe of these projects and kind of what the status is on obligation and expenditure. It's complicated because you get data in, there's corrections, we don't want to put out anything that confuses people, but so we're examining what data is available and how reliable it is and whether we could report on the universe of these projects. But certainly we will be sampling them going forward to look at how they're performing. And for FY23, if the bill passes and our authority to continue this work is in there, we would sort of proceed along that same fashion and just include any of the projects funded for the next fiscal year. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we had some observations from the project that I could share a little bit. And I think the first is that when we spoke with, in particular, appropriations staff, there was keen interest in us helping people understand timing. And so in part that had to do with the continuing resolution, but in part it has to do with the fact that once appropriations pass, it's not like checks get written to the recipients the next day. And in most cases, the funding was going to pass through agency programs where there are requirements on recipients, even if those recipients are not being competitively awarded the funds. So they still need to register in federal systems that provides, payment information and, allows us, the government, to make sure that that the risk of fraud is minimized, other kinds of things like that. There are still grant applications to complete, spending plans, monitoring plans, all those sorts of things. And often the recipients, especially as my colleagues noted, were sort of new to this. Agencies had to provide significant technical assistance to those recipients in order to get everything in order for them to receive their funds. And then some of the funding, from the FY22 projects is multi-year and had 2, 3, 4, 5, or an infinite number of years to be obligated by the agency. Right. And so agencies have set timelines for those, and those are some of the things we'll be looking at going forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that I think a lot of sort of the average person doesn't recognize, as we said, this is all within the funding that's been allocated through the discretionary funding levels, but it's 1%. So this last year was actually a little bit less than 1%. It was just under 10 billion, so there was a little room, but about 5,000 projects. That a lot of staff time goes into to putting that together, from GAO, from personal offices to committee, to sort of maintain and essentially make sure that system is in place. I think we have time for some questions. If you do have a question, my colleague has a microphone to come around to ask a question. So.
Can you hear me? Does this matter? Okay, thank you. My name's Lorelei Kelly. I'm at Georgetown Democracy, Education, and Service, a new project I'm setting up at the McCourt School. My question is, having gone and lived in small-town rural America during the pandemic to take care of a parent, I really noticed, just in talking to neighbors, how little Americans just run-of-the-mill conversations see themselves as participants in their democracy, much less their institutions. I really noticed this with the antagonisms over the masking and the pandemic, but also after January 6th. So one of the hopes I have for community grants is to also build legitimacy back for the institution. And it seems that in order to do that, we need to create and find some best practices of sort of participatory methods in sort of what, Lars, you were saying, like the dream was for this to be percolate up from grassroots almost, communities. I know a few little bright spots. I know, Anne, you documented this 2 years ago, of where there were more sort of curated by the member. So the member is still sort of the den pack leader or talking to the community. Did you see improvements of that, or new methods or other ways that we can start helping members sort of curate that so that it's a partnership with the community, but that it's more participatory?
Yeah, absolutely. I can jump in on that. Thank you, Lorelei. Definitely. I think I flagged a few examples of members who had taken the risk to try something along those lines. And I do want to just emphasize the fact that it is a risk on some level for members to try to shape the process. For me, I think there are more, the benefits outweigh the risks for members to try to open up their process to be more transparent and accountable, but you're always going to make somebody unhappy if you say, I'm going to accept projects along the following 10 priorities and that's it. Like the people in the rest of the 500 million priorities out there in your district are going to be upset. So it's interesting to see members take that risk to say, for our team, the benefit is going to outweigh any potential blowback here. Again, for the late Rep. Don Young's office to say, hey, community, what are your priorities? Or for the Kilmer team to say, here's the criteria that we're going to look at. I will say also in the course of our research and our putting together our community guide, I got to kind of follow along with a few potentially eligible recipients in my neck of the woods in Cleveland, Ohio. And it was interesting hearing some of the hesitations about engaging in this program. And again, I was just talking to them unconnected to the offices that they would be applying through. There are a lot of assumptions out there, you're right, for how this process would work and why I should not engage with it. So eligible requesters saying, well, I assume that the member is only going to pick their friends, or I assume that this process is irrevocably corrupt, or I assume that this is adding money to the federal deficit rather than choosing where to direct money that will be spent regardless. So there's a huge barrier for congressional offices to overcome in kind of addressing that skepticism and addressing misconceptions about the process. So I think the way forward there is congressional offices making their process as transparent as possible, saying, here's how I am soliciting responses, here's what my form looks like, here's the criteria that I'm looking at, here's the technical parts for how these organizations are going to receive this money. Excited to see more of that.
I can sort of speak to how our office handled this situation, because you're absolutely right. If we want to reach these smaller communities who maybe are disenchanted with the process or don't know how to engage or where to start, or we have a lot of challenges to overcome. If we want to reach them, our thought process was, okay, well then we're going to go to them. So we really heavily relied on our district representative team, who we call our outreach team. So our district reps have great relationships in the district. They go out there, they know the district better than the ledge team sitting at our desks in DC does because they're in it every day. So we had very close conversations with the district team about who should we be talking to. That's one thing. The second thing is we did a virtual open house, sort of a webinar that was open to any eligible entity in the district that wanted to participate and learn about this process. I think we shared it pretty broadly multiple times. We blasted all of our stakeholder lists for example, local government leadership, so maybe mayors of towns, city councilors, if we had their contact information. City managers were a big part of this, town managers, local sheriffs, police chiefs, nonprofits. We chose to engage with 501c3s, so anyone who we had the ability to contact them, we had their contact information, they fit into the eligible list of entities, was welcome to join this virtual open house webinar situation where they could just come, get online, and listen to us speak about our process, what we were looking for, kind of break down from the bottom, what is a CPF? What are we even talking about? What are these terms that are being thrown around? You know, there were a couple of articles in the local paper that mentioned appropriations and CPFs from the past year, so then that drove some interest for this year. And we had an hour or so where we were just there and said, okay, I'm sitting in front of a computer screen, I'm gonna tell you the basics of our process. We shared a 4-page background document that had about 2 pages of explanation and instructions, had a link to our, we used a Google form, had a link to our form where you could make an application to our office directly, but then the second 2 pages was a table we put together of all of the eligible accounts and which departments you'd be working with. We shared that. We had a webinar. We had probably 200 or so people participate who joined that webinar. First half was just us talking about the process. Second half was all Q&A, and we had questions from all kinds of folks about all kinds of pieces of this process, right? We had the basic, I don't really understand what the difference is between a CPF and this thing that I'm flying in with the National Mayors Association. What are the differences there? And then we had, on the reverse side, I have this very niche project. Can you tell me where I should apply and what account I should be looking at? We had everything. Now, what was useful in this webinar was not just that we're getting information out there, but that we had the entire outreach district team on the line. We had my entire ledge team on the line, and we could listen and hear these live interests, live comments. We shared all of our information to our constituents. I should note that this was only open to constituents. And we were able to immediately sort of course correct with some folks who maybe were looking at the wrong thing, maybe thinking about this in a way that would not be helpful to them or a good use of their resources, and instead redirect them to how to handle these scenarios. And we did a lot of one-on-one follow-up and outreach after that call as well. So step one, anybody in DC should be talking to people in the district. If you're not talking to your district team, you're not engaging properly in this process. Step two, make information available. I think that you've provided some really cool ways that other offices have done that. We're certainly going to look at some of those examples, see what we can learn and how we can grow. But for us, that was, let's do an open house. And then step three was do the follow-up. So anyone who got on that open house, we did follow up with them. Hey, was that helpful? Did you need any more information? Here's the contact information for the district rep that covers your region. Here's contact information for the LA who handles that project if you want to talk about it a little more before you make a decision. Out of that, about 200 or so people who joined the webinar, I think we had at least one touch with about 400 people from that email blast saying, here's the webinar if you want to join. About 400 people had expressed interest of unique projects. Many of those had come to us with 4 or 5 project ideas, and they were like, which of these do we do? And of that, we helped people go through this process, cut it down significantly to only isolate people spending their time and resources to apply for things that really met the eligibility criteria. And then we took it through the more formal process. Thanks.
Gentleman here.
Jeff Edelstein. So this sounds like, I love all these different ideas here, and it's verging towards what is being done at some municipalities, which you may be familiar with, called participatory budgeting, where actually the money is allocated for each district. New York City is now doing this, I believe, in every council district, $1 million+, and the community actually develops the project ideas, forms teams, and then the community actually votes on that. Now, I don't believe, if I heard you right, that any members are actually giving that authority to communities and to their constituents, and I'm sure there could be some interesting political dynamics around that. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on this moving in that direction, and particularly around this idea of getting people engaged in democracy, where they're actually voting on how that money is being spent. And I'll mention just lastly, I believe in New York City, because this is outside of the regular electoral processes, I think different council members can choose like ages of who votes on those projects. So in some cases, I think it's like anybody 12 and up. So it's actually a way to get younger people engaged in democracy. And so I'm just curious your thoughts, and to take this one step further, and then you'll have to pull the mic away from me. And maybe this goes more towards Lars with technology. Where does AI come into this in the future? No, you can ignore that part of the question.
No,
Certainly one of the challenges you bring up here is sort of the awareness and differentiation of these constituencies to understand community project funding versus the programmatic funding, or the 99% of federal funding versus the 1%, and there's a lot of nuance there. So sorry, I wanted to just put that up there.
Personally, I can't wait to see a ChatGPT written earmarks request. It ought to be fun. I'm sure we'll see some good ones in this upcoming year. But also on the participatory budgeting question, I think absolutely there's a really interesting parallel there, and I think some offices in places where there are participatory budgeting processes happening locally are certainly learning from a lot of the ways that the PB folks are having a lot of successes and also running into some pitfalls. For me, I think the important distinction there is, and this is, I will admit, a little bit inflected by the PB process happening in my hometown. I'm in Cleveland, Ohio right now. A lot of the advocates for PB want to talk about funding that eliminates the role of elected officials. So saying, hey, for constituents making that decision themselves. But I think for community project funding, there is that dialogue between the constituent and the elected representative. So what I think is really interesting there is that it is kind of flattening that relationship. So it's saying constituent to elected representative, here's how I want to be involved in these decisions about how our district is setting up our 10 to 15 projects. But there's no way to kind of take the member out of that process for community project funding. Ultimately, it is the member's decision, and there's a lot of the member gets to decide the priorities and how they're going to prioritize between the different requests there. So I think there is a distinction just in the language between the two groups. There's the language that the PB folks are using where you hear them say, all spending decisions are made by old white dudes in corner offices. And we're seeing how that is not the case for the earmarks process, that these offices are being so innovative, and how are they bringing different voices into the community.
I will just note, my boss looks at every request, and it's her making the decision at the end of the day. Staff is doing a ton of work on the front end to make sure she's only looking at a binder of 100 requests that made it to that point. Things that we have checked off is like meeting all of the necessary pieces from the committee. But at the end of the day, it is the Congresswoman making that decision. And that's hugely important. And I think a big part of this that's different from, sort of setting that aside for a second, a big part of this that's different than the participatory budgeting side of things is you're not just looking at something from a community to community spending level. You're looking at something from a community to federal spending level. So there's also sort of beyond just an eligibility test and does this meet the basics and does the community want it, you have to look at this sort of political viability test as well, right? My member can submit the request that she wants. That doesn't mean that the committee's going to take them. or that the Congress is going to vote on them. So I think there is also that piece of the member having to do that calculus and be representative for the committee, or excuse me, for the community, thinking through, okay, these are both great requests. If I have two in front of me that are by all accounts equal, one of these is going to be accepted by the committee. The other I know committee members will object to. Now, which one do I go with? So I think there is that part of the member community dialogue where the member is really taking an active role that's different than on the local level.
And we had a question online that I'd like to bring Allison in on. One of the growing pain issues potentially is that there were many recipients that did get funded that haven't actually received those funds from the federal agencies. There may be some awareness, but it's hard to say maybe, and this is a question about what the congressional offices know, but some of those funds haven't been received. What is the situation? Why is that the case? Sounds like a growing pain question. How can we move through this? So.
Yeah, no, and that's actually something we expect. And it's an important aspect of this for the recipients to understand. And some of it has to do with, the program that they're getting the funds through and what the rules are for that program. If there are application materials, other kinds of vetting that need to be done, if there's legal reviews or environmental reviews or other things, those reviews often have to happen before the funding moves to them. It may also be 2 or 3 year funding, meaning that the agency has a certain number of years before it must obligate those funds, in which case, from an agency resources perspective, it may be prioritizing moving the 1 year money first, because that has to get out the door, otherwise it becomes unavailable to the recipient. But these are all like communication challenges. At the heart of it is helping the recipients understand expectations around when they should receive the funds, communication with the agency, as to whether there are any barriers to the receipt of those funds. And those are issues that we're really going to be looking at now, that sufficient time has passed, that we could really understand, has money not moved to the recipient for reasons you can anticipate, or is there some sort of administrative hurdle that needs to be addressed?
Thanks.
I will just put in one plug for the reports that we've got out there. We do, in each of the agency reports, break down in a graphic sort of the funding and how long by program. Just from a legal perspective, recipients can expect to sort of wait to receive the funds. So you can see if your program was kind of a 1 year, you should have received the funding by the end of fiscal year 22, if it was 3 year, if it was no year. So if recipients have questions about that, they can go look at the report for the agency that they should be receiving their funds from and at least have some expectation of timing.
Right, and that's on the website, it's tracking the funds. So, and I think we can do one quick question to wrap up.
Hopefully it's quick. Oh. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting, and I've learned a lot from all of you. It also strikes me that this has implications for intergovernmental relations. And so I'm wondering, when these grant requests are coming through, are they mostly coming from constituents or advocacy groups within the district or whatever, as opposed to from the mayor's office or the county, or even if the state is involved in it? So how much of it is separate from those other governments? And also, I would include tribal governments there as well. And how much of it is coming from just constituents, organizations?
I'll start here. You all may have better data than I do because mine is largely anecdotal and just what our office experienced. I think we probably got about 2/3 some sort of other governmental entity, and then 1/3 from like a nonprofit. Now, when I say other governmental entity, I wouldn't say just mayor's offices. I would say that probably includes the state universities, which are technically nonprofits, but I think a lot of folks would put them in sort of that governmental state association bin. We had a lot of engagement from local governments that came to us from someone like the flood director, who wanted to talk about how to maybe improve a flood wall, and if that was a viable project through one of the Army Corps accounts that was open. I think that's a really unique way to be looking at some of these members of local governments who are dealing with niche issues rather than just the city's or the town's general priorities for the year. So it's about 2/3 to 1/3, with the caveat that that 2/3 is maybe a little closer to the people than one may think.
And I'll just plug in for my colleague Zach Corser, who's on the first panel, but we're going to be doing a report coming out in the near future, and we'll kind of do a little bit of the breakdown of where requests came from. So we'll get a more analytical assessment of some of that. So
Thank you very much.
yeah. Any last words from anyone? I very much appreciate being on the panel, but I just love any thoughts on where you think this is going in the 118th Congress. So.
I'm going to start.
Yeah.
I say that this is an Article 1 power. It's explicit in the Constitution. I think as we move into the 118th Congress, you'll see a lot of opportunities and interest from members, particularly on the House side, about exercising their various Article 1 powers, whether it be in oversight or with more direct control over the budget and appropriations process. So I'm excited to see what comes next, and I can tell you Congresswoman Hinson will be engaged. Can't tell you about the rest.
Likewise, I think one thing I am particularly watching is the new members coming in right now. I talk about an incredible challenge. You're setting up a new office, you're staffing up 2 offices, you're hiring all of your people. And by the way, congratulations, here you have to start your earmarks process too. But that's also where there's so much energy, and that's where there are new ideas drawing from other community, things that are happening in communities. So I think that's where we're going to see a lot of innovation. And again, I'm just hopeful that there are more structures to kind of spread that innovation among offices that can benefit from it.
What I'm tracking at the moment is the conflict between, especially on the Republican side, members who are fine with this new earmarks process and members who are more fiscal conservative, who are very annoyed that earmarks have returned. It seems at the moment that they're okay with this process existing, but it's looking like in the 118th Congress there's going to be a loud contingent who are going to be fighting against these new measures the entire time.
Yep. Good. And also.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think at GAO, we're looking forward to the fact that sufficient time has passed that we can really roll up our sleeves now and try to understand the progress that these projects are making, and to make sure that our communication lines are open, not only with the appropriations committees, but with any of the senators or members' offices who are interested in any of the observations we might have on what's going well and what can be improved.
Great. Again, thank you very much for being on this panel. It was very informative, and look for further information from the BPC in the coming weeks and months. So, thanks.